What's up, everyone? Normal Christians Podcast. My name is Bo. As always, I reserve the right to get smarter. And when I was thinking about today's episode, I thought, you know what? What better way to start a week than to talk about abuse? I mean, doesn't that just sound like a great way to start a week? And I'm kidding, sort of. It's actually is part of the topic that I'm talking about, but it goes far beyond just abuse. Abuse was just highlighted in an important way in what I'm going to talk about. But instead, I'm going to talk about something called restorative justice. And I came across this article in, I believe it's New York Magazine. Let me check real fast here. Yeah, sure. New York Magazine. It's not the New Yorker, so New York Magazine. And the title was called Will You Ever Change? Subtitle, Can Face-to-Face Meetings Between a Victim and an Abuser, a Form of Restorative Justice, Help a Society Overwhelmed with Bad Behavior? And this is from a recent part of the magazine that came out by Amelia. I don't even know how to say the last name. Not surprising. I never know how to say people's names. But this idea of restorative justice, I think, is honestly an incredible idea. And it gives me a lot of hope in a sense that these sort of things are happening. And I think before I might have heard some sense about this, but this article really brought to life some aspects that I didn't know, and it even gave an example. It was a little bit of a longer article. If somehow you have access to the New York Magazine, it's a great article to jump into. But a little longer, and what it does is it explains different parts of restorative justice, and then it gets into an actual example of what this looked like coming into play. But first, you need to understand what restorative justice is. The article says it's a form of conflict resolution that brings together survivors and offenders with a focus on repairing the damage done rather than punishing the person responsible. And then a little later down it says, people who do restorative justice, their work focuses on what survivors need to recover, and the process is designed to benefit the larger community as well. If you help people understand the impact of their choices, the thinking goes, they may change how they act in the future. So a part of this is to try to restore people, not just put people away who do things wrong, and not just to overlook people who've suffered tremendous difficulty. Instead, what the goal of this is to get justice, to get ultimately some wholeness for victims, and to try to bring those who've done terrible things to justice, but to help them understand what they've done to hopefully restore them in an important and powerful way. And the way that this happens, at least in this article, what it highlighted was something called surrogate dialogue. And the two people that I'm going to highlight that the story highlighted participated in this sort of thing. And what a surrogate dialogue is an arranged conversation called surrogate victim-offender dialogues between unrelated rape victims and perpetrators who had taken responsibility for their actions. And by the way, it's not just rape victims, but basically victims and people who did some sort of action similar. It's not the two people, so it's not the perpetrator and the victim of that crime. Instead, it's a victim with someone else who did do a crime, probably pretty similar, if not that same crime, but they're different situations completely. Obviously, you don't want to put a victim and a perpetrator together, but this is a controlled environment where someone who is a victim gets the opportunity, in a sense, to approach and ask the perpetrator or a perpetrator questions. Continuing on with this explanation, the surrogate approach was experimental, intended to meet the needs of victims for whom a direct dialogue with those who had harmed them was impossible. And this is a quote, the survivors were able to ask perpetrators the questions that everybody asks. And then the person who gave the quote, that's their name again, someone named Banks. Boy, I'm terrible with names. Anyway, getting back into it. What did I do wrong is a sort of question that might be asked. And the perpetrators were able to say, nothing. You were just in the wrong place at the wrong time. That's exactly what the survivors I worked with needed to hear. It wasn't your fault. The person who's explaining this surrogate dialogue said. And I don't know if you got it in my convoluted explanation, but again, you have these two parties, one who's a victim, one who's a perpetrator. It's not the perpetrator who hurt the specific victim, but somebody else. And the victim gets to be in this dialogue with this person to try to figure out and put their mind at ease and maybe answer some of their questions that they have. And that person said, one of the common ones is, what did I do wrong? And to be able to hear a perpetrator, be able to hear an abuser of someone else say, it wasn't your fault, you were just at the wrong place at the wrong time. This individual who helps put these on said that's exactly what the victim a lot of times needed to hear to be able to come to peace or to be able to move on and heal in some ways. Continuing on with what the article said. One woman told the lady who was explaining this dialogue, this surrogate dialogue, one woman told the person who was putting it on that all she wanted was to walk into the room, face someone who had committed violence that was similar to what her ex had done, and be strong enough to walk out. Another was ready to end her dialogue incredibly fast as soon as the man she was paired with admitted to doing wrongdoing. And then this is a quote from that woman. I wanted to hear someone take responsibility because my ex never will, she said. I just needed to know that there are men out there who can change. So this just shows a little bit of a snapshot of what this dialogue was supposed to do. For some of these women specifically, because this article dealt mostly with women and the violence that men did against them, some of these women just needed to hear, like this woman, that someone say that they were sorry. And that gave this woman peace that there are some men who are able to change. And in this other woman, she wanted to set it up just to be able to walk in, look at someone who did something terrible, like the individual who did something terrible to her, and be able to just walk out. That's what she needed for her healing. And this sort of dialogue has given the context to it, all a part of restorative justice, because it's about bringing healing and being able to restore people. And it goes deeper. Clearly there's a justice aspect. Now in the legal system, a judge, depending on the crime and the different situation, can determine, instead of this person just being thrown in jail, maybe they will put them into a restorative justice system where they do something to be restored, where justice can be served and they can be restored to society. So it all falls under this umbrella. But specifically what was highlighted is the surrogate dialogue sort of approach, where someone who, again, had something bad happen to them is able to sit across from someone who did something terrible and ask questions and be able to just have a dialogue and hopefully get some healing from that. And so, really, the article began to get into two specific people, one named Cheryl and the other named Troy. Now, little background that the article provided. Cheryl grew up in an abusive home where the dad would fly off the rails in anger, even at things like her when she was a baby crying. The article talked about how the mom would have to run downstairs so that the dad didn't fly off the rails in anger. And Cheryl's dad, when she was 20, died. And she actually said that she felt relief. But ultimately, her problems did not stop there. I think she felt this relief because her dad was so angry and abusive that she thought that this would provide relief, but it didn't. Unfortunately, she ended up with men who were abusive. After breaking up with one, for instance, it was highlighted, he came over and beat and choked her until her eardrums ruptured. But then again, later on, Cheryl had another boyfriend who turned out to be just as controlling and abusive, just like her father had been. And then she thought, maybe I am broken. Maybe all of this is really my fault. Some days were so hard, Cheryl said she would think, I just can't do one more day like this. And Cheryl would think about ending her life. And then whenever she was 37, the article highlighted that she was in another relationship, but she kind of figured out where this relationship was going, and it was not to a good place. And so she decided to call it off. And then the article highlighted what happened after she called it off. 6 weeks after the breakup, the man she broke up with, drove up to Cheryl's house, stepped from his car, and shot himself in the head in front of her. As her neighbors rushed him to the hospital, Cheryl stood outside her house and waited for the police to arrive. She had reached the bottom. And this is a quote from Cheryl. "I'm either going to die," she realized, "or I'm going to stick around and do things differently." This is how Cheryl wound up in a room with Troy, a man whom she didn't know, who had been violent with his girlfriend, to try to understand why he had done what he did. And then there's another quote from Cheryl. She said about her life, "I lived afraid for 38 years of my life. I didn't know that people didn't feel that way all the time." And I was really struck by that story because it's just so sad. It's just so sad that someone would feel that way, that would live in fear for 38 years of their lives, that would have relationship after relationship seemingly go wrong and have to maybe even think about taking her own life or just question everything. And then the article said one big thing about women who struggle with abuse or have been in abusive relationships, it says that they often blame themselves for how their partners treated them. No matter what anybody else would say, they just would blame themselves. And then it said that whenever this counselor would talk to women, she saw how it kept many women from leaving violent relationships. And she gives a quote about what some of the things that women would say, blaming themselves and keeping them in these relationships. "If I had just tied the kid's shoes," they'd say, "maybe he wouldn't have hit me." So this just builds a picture about the kind of people that hopefully this system helps. Specifically, it's highlighting women in these relationships, in these terrible relationships and abusive relationships. It's horrible stuff. And as a pastor, I have seen some bad things before, and some people hurt tremendously by other people. And so reading this really breaks my heart because I know this is a reality that many people face, and especially many women hold on to in silence. But Cheryl was sitting across in this whole dialogue, this surrogate dialogue, from a guy named Troy. And a little background on Troy, the article said that he was an only child of a single mother, but he loved to be the center of attention. Or maybe I shouldn't have said but. I should have said and he loved being the center of attention. He ended up finding alcohol and drinking. But he would keep drinking and drinking and drinking until often he was sick or he'd pass out or whatever it was growing up. And although he hated getting sick, the article highlighted that he loved feeling cool and making people laugh. And he wanted to drink more and more as a result. And then getting into a little bit more of his past. In 1992, he got married and adopted his wife's daughter. Soon they had another daughter together. He never hit his wife, but they argued all the time. Troy would pick fights to justify storming out of the house and going to drink. He wasn't around for his kids, and he withheld money from his wife. His marriage broke up in 2001, and afterwards he lived on the street. A few years later, he began dating another woman, and he fought with her also. She hated Troy's drinking, and when she confronted him about it, he lied. During one fight, Troy began to choke her. "What am I doing?" he realized, and he ran out of the house. He made it only 3 or 4 blocks before police caught him. Troy went to prison for 22 months. His 9-year-old daughter wrote him a letter saying she must be the reason he couldn't quit drinking, and it broke his heart. Woo! Another just terrible story and situation. So you have this guy named Troy, gets into drinking, was married, couldn't stop drinking, didn't do anything there. But then in another relationship, he gets in a fight, he's choking his girlfriend, and then gets sent to prison for abuse. And look, there's no excuse for that sort of stuff. I mean, it's just horrible things, and he's affecting someone's life greatly. But Troy's also a person. He's a person that the article highlighted that he began to realize he made mistakes, and he wanted to change. And he was serving his time for it, and that's how he sat across from Cheryl. So Cheryl was someone who was abused, who's now sitting across from Troy, who was an abuser. And the point was, in this controlled environment, to let Cheryl control the conversation and ask questions and really try to help her out. And it was even there to help Troy out, because if he could help her heal, that would be healing for him in a lot of ways. So it says this, the article went on to say, Cheryl had been sitting across from Troy for 15 minutes when she realized that he might be just as scared as she was. And I love that part because, they both, though they were different in different situations, they were both a little scared and worried to be there. Cheryl watched Troy as he told her what had happened, and hearing about his life made her feel less alone, too. At the end of her story, she told Troy about her ex-boyfriend who had died by suicide. Oh my gosh, Troy remembers thinking. She's carrying the guilt of this guy killing himself in front of her. He wanted very much to tell her that she wasn't responsible for what had happened that night. After an hour, Cheryl was ready to ask Troy the question she had turned over in her head for years. And this was the question. When you were fighting with your ex, when you were hurting her, what were you thinking of? What were you thinking about her? Let me repeat that. Butchered it. When you were fighting with your ex, when you were hurting her, what were you thinking about with her? The question thread through each of her relationships all the way back to her father. When she asked it, Cheryl remembers that Troy looked right at her and said, I wasn't thinking about her at all. I was just thinking about how angry I was. Cheryl asked to take a break, and she and Marcy, who was one of the leaders of that conversation, stepped outside. It wasn't raining anymore, and the air was cool and tasted clean. I knew at that moment that it wasn't my fault at all. The way I had been treated by all the men in my life, Cheryl said. I had been told that over and over, but until this abuser could look me in the eye and say it, I just didn't believe it. Then she left, eventually, feeling for the first time that she wasn't carrying around the entire weight of everything that had happened to her anymore. And I love what had happened there. Again, here are two people who've both one did terrible things and the other had terrible things happen to her. And they're able to sit here and have a dialogue. And for Cheryl to ask that question that she's wanted to ask, that she would never be able to ask to her father or all those who abused her, but she could ask to someone who did something similar to what those other people did to her. And then Troy could answer the question and tell that in the moment, it wasn't her fault. He wasn't thinking about her, the person he was abusing at all. And what that did for her to help bring healing. Now, it took many more years for her to heal, and she probably is still healing. But ultimately, she's been able to get to a better place because she was able to have this dialogue. And then even Troy was eventually able to get out, and he's able to turn his life around in some ways himself and to feel like he's giving back through being honest about his story and taking responsibility. And really, when I was reading this, there was a lot going through my mind. As I said, and if you didn't know, I'm a pastor, so I deal with people, not these sort of situations often, but these sort of things have come up in different ways, these tough situations. And it's extremely difficult. It's hard. And I don't know how many times you sit across from people and you're praying, you're thinking, I don't know what to do. Lord, you've got to help. You've got to give me wisdom, or you've got to open something up. And so we do our best to listen. We do our best to try to care, specifically for victims I'm talking about, and provide whatever we can to help people. But there's always an aspect, and I love this quote that was in it. It was a quote from someone, the lady I mentioned earlier, who was talking about this whole dialogue process that's a part of restorative justice. She said, justice means different things to different people. You can never fully have justice, right? Something's been taken. For me, it's about what we can do to make a victim as whole as possible. And I love that quote. I don't fully agree with it, and I'll explain in a second why I don't fully agree with it. But I do think it's important, and it's right in a lot of ways. Justice does mean different things to different people. And there is this feeling with justice that even when someone's punished, that there's still not a wholeness that's there. And so this individual is saying part of all this is to try to make the victim as whole as possible, doing the best we can with what we have to help this person and make them whole. And when I hear this, when I read this story, as a Christian, man, I think that this just resonates with me so much with justice in the Bible, and even getting back to the basic Christian principles and what we believe. And I'm not going to read it, but there was a section that I actually have in my notes right here where this person talks about the need for restorative justice and the need for being able to have these sort of conversations. And really, what she was getting at is that so often we're punitive, where we throw people in jail and we do all these things because we don't have any other alternatives. We just don't think there's other ways. And also she says that revenge is exhilarating, to be able to see someone who ultimately inflicted violence. It's, in a sense, as she explained, exhilarating to see them suffer even a little bit. But what it does is it just creates circles of violence. It just pushes things around and all this sort of stuff. And ultimately, she talks about a common refrain in these conversations when we're talking about violence is the need to reform the toxic culture that allows abuse and all these sort of things with little consequences. If one way into that culture shift requires moving past judgment and extending hope for change to the bad men, will we be willing? So in that sentence, it's part of a bigger thing that she's hoping that these different means of justice, restorative justice, these different conversations can help reform people, because we all want to see this stop. Who doesn't want to see abuse stop and these sort of things end? But that's going to mean at times that we just stop throwing people under the bus or being so punitive in different ways and actually working to restore people. Now, certainly, there are people who aren't willing to change. And so restorative measures are not going to work. There's certainly those people. But there are others like Troy who, even while realizing he was doing it, realized that this was not right. And then he started on a journey where it's been a long journey, but he's there to get better and help. But far too often what happens, and this is where it gets more into the Christian principles, is especially us as Christians, we fall into the trap like everyone else at looking at people who've done bad things and say, well, you know what? You don't deserve love or a second chance or a chance to be restored or whatever it is. As I did an episode about putting people in a box, we end up reducing people to their worst moment, whatever it is. Or we reduce them to what they did. Now, that doesn't mean we overlook it. Of course, there needs to be justice, of course. But, man, being able to extend love and hopefully being able to restore people and that whole restorative justice sort of thing, to me, that's such a Christian thing to do. And all I have to do is look at our faith, right? We're all guilty. We're all sinners. We all fall short of the glory of God. No one, not a single person, is good enough to get to God, to bridge the gap that we created with our rebellion against Him. So we deserve punishment. We rightfully deserve separation from God for all of eternity. But what is the story? What is the overarching story of the Bible? You could summarize it in the very simple way of John 3:16, right? For God so loved the world that He sent His only Son into this world, not to condemn it, but for us to ultimately have a way to come back to Him, in relationship with Him, to spend eternity with Him. And God's story that He lays out is He's bringing everything back to Eden, back to the beginning, where there was no separation between God and man. So even though we are guilty, we're restored through the perfect life, the sacrificial death, and the resurrection of Jesus. So whenever I hear things like this, man, my mind goes to the gospel. And I love that these sort of things are out there, that these sort of ways to get people back and not just give up on them and not just say, you did that and that's all you will ever be. I love that there's a way to give people a new shot, to give people a new life. And there's a quote by Troy that was in the article and I thought was important. He said, I was told numerous times it is very important to forgive yourself. I tend to have low self-esteem. Maybe I'm not worthy of being forgiven. But at some point in my life, I actually started looking at the work I've done. That was when it started clicking. Okay, you're not the old Troy. This is the new guy. I'm not the a-hole that my head tells me I am. And the reason I included that quote is because I think it's so cool that as Troy has gone through the process, he sees, what he knows what he's done's bad. And he has ask for forgiveness, and he's trying the best he can to give back. But he's seeing himself as a new Troy, not the old one, not the one who made those mistakes, as someone else who can be better, who can have a future, who could change his destiny ultimately. And that's what I think is cool. I think back to a guy that I met at a church that I was helping walk through some difficult times. I'll just, for the sake of this, call him Tom. And I would sit down with Tom, and Tom had such a rough childhood. It's such a rough situation. It had done some not great things. But he ended up at this church, and I remember talking and walking him through things and seeing a change in Tom. And ultimately, I remember telling this, and I truly believe it. His story was beautiful, just like I think so many other stories are beautiful. When we get to look at people and their change and realize, wow, look at what God is doing in your life. And you aren't just changing your future and your destiny. As you go on, maybe to have a family, or maybe just friends and who you affect, you're changing the destinies of others because of the change that's happening in your life. And that's why I think these things are so important. And bringing it back to Christianity, as Christians, we should be all about justice, right? We should never overlook some of the terrible things that people have done. But having said that, also being able to offer forgiveness in the right times, at the right context. Also being able to extend love. Also not giving up on people whenever we can. Being able to still reach out, still talk to them, and hopefully still walk them through to experience God, His love, and His life-changing power, right? Isn't it the kindness of God that has brought all of us to repentance in one way or another? So how can we not extend that kindness to other people, even the worst of society? Again, there will be some people who don't want to change. There will be some people who do not want to hear our message or accept the love that we have. But there are some that do. And there are some people who are just looking for others to have a little faith in them, to be able to extend a little bit of love, and be able to look at them and not just see someone who did something terrible, but also see something else. So maybe something that they could be, or at the very least, that is still someone who's valuable. Why? Because they're created in the image of God. And if they're created in the image of God, they have eternal value, and we should care about that. And so when I thought about this, man, it just, to be honest, there were a couple times in the article where I teared up. Not surprising if you know me, I'm kind of a big softie in that sort of sense. I don't know what changed in me, but, your boy's crying at like Home Depot commercials or something, where, some father and, I don't know, his son or his wife, or they're out there like planning something or building a shed, and I'm just sitting there going like, oh, so beautiful. That's what it should be. So I'm a big softie, so that's no surprise, but it's just moving to see people be restored, to get a second chance, to be able to have a chance at a new life. It's amazing sort of stuff. And also for people of abuse and these victims, being able to walk with them through some of the difficulty, and giving them the opportunity to take control of a conversation and ask tough questions they could never do otherwise. I love it. I love it because it helps healing. It helps them slowly be restored. So this is an article I read, and there was a lot there, and I had a lot more to say. But I think it comes down to this. Christians, man, we need to be about healing. We need to be about love and restoring and healing people. And I think that's a big part of bringing the kingdom down to earth, in a sense. Our kingdom mandate. Go out, make disciples of all the nations. Yeah, we're saving people, we're bringing them, but we're bringing the kingdom here in a lot of senses. So a big part of that is sticking our necks out, helping foster healing in different ways, and not giving up on people, whether they are the abuser or the person who did something terrible, or the person who's had a lot go on and is struggling. Because that's another thing too. And I highlighted it from the article. But unfortunately, what happens is, let's just say, because this article talks about women and abuse, women can continue to get into these relationships and can continue to be in these cycles. And what can happen too often is we look from the outside and we judge and we go, well, that's your fault, or you should probably stop making bad decisions, or you should stop doing this or that or whatever. instead of extending love and maybe realizing that something else is going on that's helping feed into this terrible cycle. And again, this all just comes back to talking about this restorative justice, talking about these dialogues that were highlighted that I honestly didn't know about till I read the article about these surrogate dialogues. But it just gives me a lot of hope that there is some healing going on. And I hope as Christians that we're helping foster it wherever we're at, with kindness, with love, and with not giving up on people, no matter who they are or what they've done, because they're infinitely valuable, right? So that's all I've got. So I'm sure it's a great way to start your week to think about this, but I do think it's important. And I do think these sort of things are cool to just know that they're out there in a lot of ways. Maybe you know someone who could use something like this. Maybe this spurs you on to find out some information to help get them connected. Whatever it is, thank you for taking the time to listen. And before I go, man, 3515. And until next time, God bless.